for our sixth form students who are presenting their projects tonight, this evening has a second purpose. It enables them to fulfil the final part of the assessment criteria for the extended project qualification. For the qualification requires them to produce a piece of work on a subject of their choosing. In these students' cases, they produce the dissertation. It requires them also to produce an activity log or a diary outlining how their thinking about their project has changed over time. And it also requires them to deliver a presentation to a non-specialist audience, that's you. And after their presentations, they're required to invite questions from you, the audience, and they're assessed on their ability to manage the question and answer session that follows their presentations.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure today to present to you my E.P.Q project. To what extent did Nietzsche have an influence on early 20th century American and British writers, with particular critical analysis and reference to D.H. Lawrence and Robertson Jeffers?
Conversely, I believe that cattle vaccination could yet prove extremely valuable. Cattle would be much easier to vaccinate than badgers. However, it is currently illegal under European legislation to vaccinate cattle against bovine tuberculosis, as it is not possible to distinguish between vaccinated and infected animals. Whilst it seems that this scientific issue may soon be overcome, it is likely to remain for some time illegal to vaccinate cattle.
My extended project is about the Holocaust and whether or not it was inevitable. It was something that I was interested in researching, particularly after my trip to Auschwitz last year as part of the Lessons from Auschwitz project. I basically wanted to find out whether or not Hitler intended for the Holocaust to actually happen in the way that it did, whether he intended for a recourse to mass extermination and death camps, or whether it was something that sort of spiraled out of his control over the course of the war.
Now, Horner has other theories about Tyrannosaurus being a scavenger, but they just aren't true. They're just silly. He says that Tyrannosaurus had small eyes. It just didn't. If you compare the eyes of Tyrannosaurus to other predatory dinosaurs, its eyes are actually larger compared to all the others. You know, so it actually had effective eyesight.
Taylor found that workers using their own techniques and tools were impossible to monitor and therefore inherently inefficient. So what he said was that we had to break work tasks down into basic motions, eliminate the wasted motions, and time the remaining motions, and this would be the expected rate of production. And this is what he called his time and motion study.
In analysing the pressure exerted on the EU budget by new members to the EU, I concluded that the new members benefit from EU funding, but they contribute less to the budget, in many cases due to having smaller gross domestic products, or GDPs. And in many cases also, these gross domestic products don't increase after a session.
What Krepin did is he instigated a dichotomy, whereby he split psychiatry of previously many diseases not known and no one had classified it at all, into two distinct separate groups, manic depression and schizophrenia.
And he says in his poem, my Latin isn't very good, but he says in his poem, Quia absurdium, which means because it is absurd, he says, choose the Christian sheepcoat, because faith will cover your head from the man-devouring stars. And this is obviously a very sarcastic way of looking at how Christian morality is kind of blocking us from what we can become. There's no way that faith can stop you from the man-devouring stars. It's just such a powerful image.
Are there any others? Probably be the last one.
That's a very complex question.
Controversial.
How have I become interested in Nietzsche? That's actually quite a good question.
I expect Stevenson might have, don't know if he had ventured further south, but he was a northerner, so I don't think he would have dared to have come down here really. But,
Hitler did increasingly isolate himself. He kind of stopped attending certain things. I mean, the Wannsee Conference is one example, but there would be others. And he increasingly left decisions to other party members who were basically kind of guessing at what he wanted and then reacting to that. Again, I think there's some weight to his suggestion that there was a radicalisation in trying to get his attention. So I think you could find significant weight for arguing with a bit of research that Hitler knew what was going on, but how much of it he actually wanted to deal with himself is perhaps debatable.
Did you like the man? Was he interesting?
He was very interesting. He was a civil engineer, mechanical engineer, marine engineer, everything else all rolled into one. So I think he was a very clever man in that respect. But he didn't really have much respect for his workers, and he was a bit big-headed, really. So a bit full of himself.
My brother has a collection of books that sometimes I like to scour through. And he actually had Beyond Good and Evil in his bedroom. And the reason I picked it out actually was because I really liked the cover. It was really colourful. And I actually ended up taking it into the bath and reading it. And it was something that I didn't understand. I had no idea what he was going on about. But he was so poetic in the way that his writing style, it was like sort of prose and verse. The prose was very like verse style, and it was just beautiful the way that he was writing. And I thought, if I actually like the way he's writing, and I don't understand what it is he's writing, what it is he's writing about must actually be quite good. So that's how I got into him. Yeah.
And I was astonished at the little, so no one really knew who he was. Like in the biology department, I asked all the teachers, they were like, Prepon, like, Freud, oh yeah. And so that kind of made me motivated to actually, find out what he did, because he's actually quite impressive. So.
Bankers are going to do the same work, whether they get the bonus or not. But I think that situation again supports Herzberg's view that money's a hygiene factor, because I think increasing the bank managers' bonuses as they are isn't really going to do very much to their working or to their productivity. But taking it away, however, may well cause them to not work quite so hard.
In reading the small section of literature which I could cover, it was difficult to agree with one of them only. A particular source which I did find helpful was an article in 2003 called What Effect Will Enlargement Have on the EU? And that covered pretty much all the bases which I covered within my project, and it also suggested further areas of investigation.
Recent continued sort of analysis of the badger culling trials, which I referred to, suggests that badger culling, with time, badger culling, the effects, the perturbation effects that I mentioned may decline, and badger culling may be effective. And I think that highlights one of the problems that I had in my extended project, in that I wasn't able to access some of the latest research and some of the latest findings. And so, if I'd been able to get access to these more recent papers, I might have reached a different conclusion. And that's perhaps a flaw of the project, and something that I would have liked to explore further.
He was a poet,
Yes, yeah, poet. He lived in California. He was very, as Nietzsche was, he was very solitary. He lived in a house called Tor House up on the cliffs overlooking the sea, and I think he was just so surrounded by nothingness that he actually came to love it. He rejected Christianity. He rejected things like symbolism. He rejected the crucifix and the idea of the hive. And actually, in one of his poems, his main theories, obviously, as I've discussed, are the wild god and inhumanism. And to summarise that, there's one passage where there's a hawk on a rock, and he's talking to humanity in this poem, and he says, I think this here is your emblem, dark power, bright peace, which success cannot make proud or failure cast down. And I think that, that quote embodies his entire philosophy quite nicely. It's just looking beyond humans who have become so tight and internal, and look beyond that and see if we weren't here. He says the heartbreaking beauty would remain if there was no heart to break for it. And he says we should look beyond our interpretations of things to what they actually are themselves. And that's kind of just a general summary of his philosophy and who he was as a writer. He wrote quite a few long poems, spoke fluent Latin and Greek and stuff like that, so he actually interpreted some of the Greek plays, which were quite interesting to read. He put his own spin on them and stuff. But,